what causes the stomach flu? It's actually not stomach flu anymore, right? It's gastroenteritis. Most commonly by bacteria or viruses. What we see out here in this community, it's most likely by viruses. I was just reading an article today that there's a new strain of norovirus from Australia. It's called the Sydney strain. In the last 1 year, 60% of all noroviruses in this country were from that Sydney strain. So every 3-4 years, the norovirus changes its strain. So even if you got exposed today with one strain, maybe a few years later, it will be some other different strain of it. So you're not building any immunity towards it at all, even after getting exposed to it. Okay, some facts about the regular seasonal flu. A flu shot cannot cause the flu illness. The flu shot that we take is from a killed virus, and so it cannot actually give you flu. Misconception again is that a lot of people say, oh, we took the flu shot one time, but the next day we got sick. That is not true. And we can talk more about that, why it's not true, and what happens there. Even when you have flu, even if you are not contagious, even if you are not symptomatic, you are still contagious. A lot of times people think, oh, we don't have the cough or the sneeze, so we are okay. But that's not true. You can still be contagious without having any symptoms. The virus, the flu virus, can survive on at least 24 hours on surfaces, hard surfaces, but on clothing, it does not survive for more than a couple hours. That is one of the reasons why when public health or physicians say, you know, when you sneeze in your sleeve, that's because of that reason. Because when you're sneezing on surfaces, it will last for 24 hours. But if you sneeze in your sleeves, it will probably be there only for an hour or so and then die. And again, vaccine provides the best immunity against the flu. Let's talk about immunizations. A lot of myths about vaccine safety. The vaccines are not safe at all. They cause a lot of harmful illnesses and deaths, which is again not true. And I'm saying fact, as of today, as we know, vaccines are very safe. Most of the adverse effects from vaccines are only on the site of injection, and those are also very minor ones. They get better in about a day or two, but very rarely you will see major complications or death. Okay, there was a big myth about vaccines causing autism. You know, Wakefield did this study in '98, I think, where he published very extensively about the relationship between autism and vaccination. In 2004, Institute of Medicine released a report which extensively studied that and saying that there was no effect between autism and vaccines. And in 2010, all the journals that had published the study from Wakefield actually retracted that because they found out that his study was flawed, and there were that he had cheated in his results. This, I don't know if it is wonderful to hear this, but vaccines do not guarantee protection also. We always encourage people to take vaccines, but it's not a guarantee that it will protect you from getting sick. It will most likely protect you from not getting severely sick, but you probably will get sick if you get exposed. Lastly, a few more myths. When we hear about vaccines, we think it's only for kids. That's not true. Seasonal influenza vaccine is recommended for everybody above the 6-month age. The HPV, the human papillomavirus, shot is not only for girls, but it is, when it started initially, it was publicized for preventing cancer in women, but it can also prevent the same thing in men. Pregnant women cannot get vaccines, that's not true. In fact, it is recommended in pregnancy to get the vaccine so that it prevents you from the illness during pregnancy. And if you get sick during pregnancy with vaccine preventable diseases, it's worse than getting the vaccine. And then finally, the last one was, again, people who don't like vaccines say that it's a cash cow for doctors and pharmaceutical companies. It's actually not true. It's not true at all, because pharmaceutical companies do not make any money out of vaccines. They are doing it, I don't know, out of goodwill, I think, but they don't really make any money out of vaccines. Thank you.
So I'll roll through the last section here fairly quickly. This is the receiver, isn't it? So we're going to finish up talking about some plastics in food and some milk issues. So the first topic is BPA, bisphenol A. I think some of you have heard about it. How many people have heard about BPAs? In what context have you heard about it? Bottles?
Plastic.
Baby bottles is a big thing, isn't it?
Things stored in plastic or packaged
Sure.
in plastic.
Yeah, so what is it? Well, it's an industrial chemical. It's been around for a long, long time. Probably a good 60 years or so. And it gives the rigidity to plastics, to a lot of plastics. So where do we find it? It's in things like this. Any hard, rigid plastic containers, food containers, those frozen, heat in the microwave dishes, vegetables and entrees and things like that. You see them in water bottles, infant bottles. You see it in the liner of cans, canned foods. Underside of bottle caps, like beer caps or screw top wine bottles. BPA in that as well. And so we have quite a few exposures. There was a study a couple of years ago by CDC, and they had a random sample of about 2,500 urine samples. Pretty representative, they thought, throughout the nation. They found that 93% of people, 93% of those urine samples had BPA in. Now, does that mean that's at a detectable level? Does that mean that it's biologically significant or physiologically significant? That's the whole story. The CDC thinks that that data is pretty representative of the United States, but the real issue is that we've got some pretty decent animal studies that suggest that maybe we ought to be taking a better look at these things. This is going to be hard for you to see. Remember, how many people are old enough to remember saccharin and cyclamates and all that stuff? Remember, the big issue with those was bladder cancer, right? But a lot of those studies, even though they did take them off the market, I think saccharin's still on or not? That's off too. Cyclamates went right away. A lot of those toxicology studies, and Dr. Bill is sitting in the audience here, he's a toxicologist, he can correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of those lab animal studies had just massive doses. So if you transferred those to humans on a milligram per kilogram basis, it would be like, I don't know, somebody would know, Dan was saying about marijuana toxicity. You'd have to eat like a pound of cyclamate a day for a year to get the same effect. Not the case with BPAs. If you look at the lab animal data over here in milligrams per kilogram of body mass, you're looking at anywhere from 2 to 40. And the numbers that you're seeing in people, actually seeing in people, 100 all the way up here, occupational exposure for people who work with BPA, but then you're getting 14.7, 11, 1.5 it looks like here, and 1. These are in that same milligram per kilogram of body weight where you're seeing in lab animals some real definite pathology. So it gives you pause, FDA and CDC says, well, we think they're probably pretty good. We think they're safe at the current levels. But the National Toxicology Program through the National Institutes of Health says, we really ought to kind of reevaluate, the jury's still out on this stuff, because there's some evidence that, especially in developing fetuses and young kids, brain behavior and prostate gland is probably susceptible, possibly susceptible. You know, it's gotten to the point where Josh Sharfstein, with whom I used to work when I worked in DC in 03, 04, he used to be the chief of staff for Representative Henry Waxman out of California, and then when Obama won in 08, he got appointed as deputy commissioner. Josh is an MD, he's a pediatrician, and he came out with that. He said, you know, we probably ought to look at this data, and if you can, maybe reduce your exposures. Don't have anything definite yet, but we probably ought to think about it. So right now, a toxicology program is just got an infusion of money in the last budget, when we actually did pass the budget. And so they're looking at it. The interesting thing, this is from the National Toxicology Program too, and this slide is maybe a little bit iffy. One thing about FDA, they're really, really hesitant to really say, by golly, this causes that. You know, they're really conservative about things. So when National Toxicology and FDA says, we have some concerns about this stuff, you probably ought to take it seriously. Okay? There's no proof yet, but it's probably something we ought to take seriously. So how does BPA get in the body? Well, you know, we just talked about it. Liner of cans, rigid plastic containers, microwaving stuff, plastic dishes and things like that. This is an area that really makes me nervous. You know, these plastic spoons, knives, forks, sporks, all those things, you know, that we use all the time. That's BPA. That has BPA in it. The real issue is, though, the degree to which you were probably exposed has more to do with whether you heat them or not. Probably just using it in cold or room temperature, probably not that big of a deal, nor is the age of the product. It's whether you ought to heat them or not. So Sharfstein and FDA said, you know, we probably ought to reduce it, so how do we do it? How do we reduce our exposure? Well, the big thing is don't microwave this stuff. And this is one of these things I've been harping at our students all the time, because they get out busy and they get these lean cuisine that I shouldn't say names, but they get these things that you buy frozen that come with a thin wrap over it and they're plastic, and they slap them in the microwave for 2 minutes or so, zap them, and then you eat it. You're probably really increasing your BPA exposure by doing that. You probably shouldn't be at home storing stuff in rigid plastic or any plastic containers and microwaving it. Dump it out, put it in something glass or ceramic, and stick that in the microwave. Or put it in a pot, heat it up that way. Reduce your use of canned foods. We just had, Dr. Johnson and I were talking in our policy class last semester about home canning. A lot of people don't remember that we can can foods, you know. We used to do that all the time. We still do in our family. Fresh, frozen, good stuff too. These little logos on the bottom of plastics are important to look at. The ones that are 3, 7, and 6 probably have BPA in them. 2, 4, and 5 probably don't. 2 is milk jugs. I don't know, 4 and 5, 2 I recognize. I brought, no I didn't. I brought in a styrofoam cup, and right on the bottom it's stamped number 5. So when you go to gas stations or you go to these kind of events and they're serving coffee and they have styrofoam cups, to me I don't drink it because to me it tastes like gasoline. And I like coffee, and you know, you put a styrofoam, there's something that I don't like about it. But after I started finding out that it probably had BPA and we're sticking hot liquid in it, probably, you know, at least me, I don't want to be drinking a polystyrene. Again, glass, porcelain, stainless steel containers, and really baby bottles, make sure they're BPA free. There's some really good evidence from our own researchers here. And this is the kind of research, the cutting edge research that our government agencies, our regulatory agencies aren't really too adept at picking up right away. Jody Flawes' lab right down the hall here has done a lot of work on the effect of BPA on follicular development and steroidogenesis, and how follicles, human follicles, are affected by BPA levels. And also that some of these BPAs are PCBs and PBBs. They have estrogen or endocrine mimicking capabilities. So this isn't even on the radar screen of what we're talking about yet. You know, we're talking about cognitive development, we're talking about prostatic effects in fetuses. But this is a whole another area of research that suggests that maybe we ought to be paying attention to this stuff. Let's talk about water real quick. One of my pet peeves, if I can editorialize a bit. You know, we set up these public forums, and I think somebody quoted me as saying that, actually it's not an original quote of mine, I saw it on a bumper sticker probably 30 years ago. It said, you're entitled to your opinion, but you're not entitled to make stuff up. And we're trying to give you evidence-based stuff here, but a little opinion creeps in periodically. This is a big, big billion-dollar industry. You know, it's not only, it's only, what, last 30, 35 years that we've had bottled water. I know younger people thought that it was always grown, but we didn't always have these things. Bottled water is generally recognized as safe by FDA. Now, generally recognized as safe is not just a phrase, but it's a regulatory term used by FDA. GRAS is the acronym. It's pronounced as GRAS. And so when Dr. Johnson was talking about energy drinks, those were not subject to FDA regulation because they are considered to be dietary supplements, just like dietary supplements are, vitamins, minerals, all that stuff. And they have been traditionally considered, generally recognized as safe. And so that falls in this little loophole under the Dietary Supplement Health Education Act. The SHADE is the regulatory act that disallows FDA from really having any oversight on this stuff. When I was working in DC, we tried to overturn the SHADE, and we got thrown out of the water by the manufacturers. But anyways, there have been some outbreaks associated, not many, 12, 14, 15, associated with bottled water. Some of them were with the same bacteria that Waystead was just talking about, with gastroenteritis, protozoan, to bacteria down there. Also had some organic compound contamination of gasoline byproducts and really nice carcinogenic ethylbenzene over there. But you know, nothing really, not real common, but they have happened. Where does it come from? I was going to show you a 2-minute video, but we really don't have the time for it. It's a CNN video. This is the Jardine water treatment plant, drinking water treatment plant in Chicago. Navy Pier is, does this work? No. Oh, the pointer doesn't work. Navy Pier is right here. This is on just north of Navy Pier. About 25 to 30, 35% of bottled water comes from municipal water sources. And now FDA did say that you have to put that on the bottle. So it says MWS, I guess. And when we take our public health students up to Jardine, we also take them to the public health lab up in Chicago and talk about a lot of things in our public health clinical rotation. I was asking the manager at a lab last summer, I said, you know, this water coming from Lake Michigan basically doesn't have to be processed. They bring it in from a crib 2 miles off. It's 120 feet down. All they have to do is add a little alum to it to flocculate the precipitate in water, you know, plant material, things like that. Otherwise, it's ready to go. It's ready to drink. And I said, well, do you ever sell bottled water? And he just got a big smile, and he said, we make a lot of money selling bottled water. They have a whole lot of bottle companies that buy Lake Michigan water, bottle it, and then sell it. And he said, the silly thing is, it's right here. Chicago City water costs them less than 1 cent per gallon out of your tap. Bottled water works out to be about $6.40 a gallon. So that's a lot of money to be paying for convenience, isn't it? I didn't put in the slide, but Consumer Reports had a paper about 3 years ago. And it did a taste test on bottled water because people say, oh, I don't like the way my water tastes. They had blind taste tests, municipal water supplies from, I don't remember how many, 20, 30 different municipal sources, probably 20, 30 different bottled water, and people couldn't tell the difference. In fact, most of the time, bottled water, if anything, didn't taste as good as municipal supplies. Bottled water produces about, let's see, let's do the math there. That would be 3 billion pounds of plastic waste per year, 1.5 million tons, right? 80% of that goes right in the landfill or in the water. This is the Anacostia River. The picture I took in 2004. While I was working in DC, we did an Earth Day cleanup of the Anacostia. You know, Potomac comes in, DC is sitting here, Potomac comes in from the west, Anacostia comes down from the north and west, separates DC from Maryland. We were on the Anacostia in a canoe, Saturday and Sunday, and then the following Saturday. This is an eddy in the river, just a little inlet. Took a picture from the back of the canoe where we would pick up all these bottled waters. There's a lot of polystyrene in here too, takeout containers. Then we'd wait about 15 minutes for the next layer to come up, and then we'd pick that up. So using this stuff is not without consequence. There's a huge carbon footprint. And you could go to this website. We'll have these slides on the Center for One Health Illinois website. We'll probably also have the video as well. But you could go to some of these resources and look at some of this stuff. It's real easy to find. I think a real good summary slide is this cartoon I just found the other day. And this is, I actually verified all this. This is all true. Greenberg is the author. But I think you can probably all read that, even though we have some of the best water in the world. Safest, cleanest, tastiest. We spend all that money on bottled water. Generates a lot of oil, generates a lot of carbon for the atmosphere, contributes to climate change. Just for the cachet, I guess, of thinking that it comes from some pristine source. So take-home points, if we're talking about take-home points, and again, this maybe gets in more opinion than anything, but, you know, use your tap water. Get a BPA-free container and use your tap water. Drink out of the water fountain. It's really expensive, and the environmental impact is really pretty tremendous. Let's finish up on antibiotics and milk, and then we'll get into question and answers, because we really want to hear from you. So the pasteurized milk ordinance was brought on board in the late 20s. It was either 27 or 29, specifically to pasteurize milk and keep us free from brucellosis and tuberculosis, two big scourges in human health. Cause a lot of death, a lot of suffering, a lot of decrease in quality of life. Part of the pasteurized milk ordinance requires that our milk producers, our dairy producers, hold milk every time they give a shot of any pharmaceutical to a lactating cow, whether it's an antibiotic or an analgesic, a fever reducer, anything. They have to hold milk, right? So if I have old Bossy here and she's getting 100 pounds of milk and she has mastitis or pneumonia and I give her a shot, after that 3 or 4 or 5 day course of antibiotics, I have to hold the milk generally about 96 hours, 8 milkings, 4 days after that last shot before I can ship that milk. And those withdrawal times are set up because we know that it takes that long for the animal to process that drug. Liver metabolism, kidney excretion, GI excretion, blowing off through the lungs, however it's excreted. So we know that if we tested that milk after that 4 day withdrawal time, we're not going to find anything. Maybe some metabolites, maybe, but we're not going to find the active drug. Milk is tested for antibiotics 4 times generally before it gets to us, before we get it in Gallon Jug at County Market or Schnucks or Meyer or wherever else. So if a guy treats his cow, he generally is going to be a little paranoid about shipping hot milk. So he's got cow site tests that he can use. If they're negative on that, okay, it goes in the tank. But regardless whether you test it or not, every time a milk hauler picks up milk at a farm, they test it. They take a sample, test it at the lab when it gets there. Goes from that primary processor into a large silo that contains God knows how many 1,000 gallons of milk. And it gets tested again, and then it goes to the final finisher where it gets turned into fluid milk or ice cream or cheese or whatever, and it gets tested again. Okay? So there's at least 3 tests, and usually 4 for antibiotics in milk. The real stick in the regulation, rather than a carrot, is that the producer is at really big financial risk if he gets caught with a hot load. If it's just the hauler, if that truck is contaminated, it's usually $5,000 to $6,000 he's got to pay. His insurance company will cover it one time. After that, you're on your own. You got to pay for it. If it gets to the first processor and gets into a silo and contaminates that whole silo, we're talking $50,000, $60,000 out of pocket. So there's a huge financial incentive to keep your milk clean. Okay? So why do we care? Well, the big thing is we worry about antimicrobial resistance, AMR. We're worried about increasing our antibiotic load in the environment, in our own bodies by taking it in orally, by drinking dairy products. We're worried about feeding dairy products to calves, bottle calves. We're worried about antibiotics just in increasing antimicrobial resistance. We're worried about human allergies. A lot of people, some people, not a lot, some people are sensitive to penicillin-based antibiotics. So they have allergies to it. It's just a yuck factor too. Who wants stuff in their food? It's just, that's the big part of it on the consumer side. We hear stories about contaminants, adulterants in foods. It's just a big yuck factor. Who needs to deal with that? That's not a good marketing scheme. My cows produce antibiotic-full milk or hormone-laced milk. That's not good marketing. A big thing too is that it really destroys cheese production. You have to have cultures to produce cheese, right? So if you have antimicrobials in cheese, in the milk, and you're trying to make cheese, the cheese makers really don't like antibiotics. They get really nervous. It's amazing what you can find on Google Images. So again, when we're up at Jardine Water Treatment Plant, we troop down the road and go to the Illinois Department of Public Health Lab. They have one section of the floor that's all about testing consumer products, dairy products, in this one area. And so they'll pull milk samples, cheese samples, dairy, ice cream. And I was talking to the director of that part of the lab, and he's been there 17 years, and they test every day. In 17 years, they've never found a positive for antimicrobials in any dairy product in Chicago. The dairy industry every year conducts over 3.3 million tests. Less than 1/10 of 1% of all those samples show a positive for antibiotics. And that's usually on that first test or the second test at the hauler. It never gets to the first processor being positive for antibiotics. And so FDA will actually come out in 2011 and say this: neither conventionally produced nor organically produced milk contains illegal antibiotic residues. So my question is, I teach a course up at the School of Public Health on Wednesdays up in Chicago, and mostly urban kids, juniors and seniors, undergrads. Why is it that yesterday, of 18 students, I said, how many of you know that there's antibiotics in the milk that you buy in the store? 14 out of the 18 raised their hands. Where does that come from?
Marketing. Marketing.
Yeah, marketing. And who's doing the marketing?
Organic. It's the biggest
It
fallacy.
doesn't incriminate, but yeah, there's marketing by implication. If I'm pushing my Horizon Dairy milk and it says produced without antibiotics, it's implying that that stuff over there has it. So it's all about market share. So anyways, it's very frustrating, but these are some of those myths and legends that we'd like to get rid of. So if you filled out your cards, people have handed me some already. Please pass them up and we'll entertain your questions.
Anybody need a card? Doesn't have one?
Okay. Let's start with for Dan Lynn. How do you, just a second, I have to get some ID here. Dan Lynn, how do you explain the resistance to legalizing marijuana when alcohol and tobacco are regulated? Why won't the federal government go there in quotation marks? What is the human cost of criminalizing this substance?
Well, the human cost is enormous, both in people who are deprived or denied of an option for medicine. If you're talking about people with multiple sclerosis, cancer, HIV/AIDS, the option to have this in the doctor's arsenal for potential medicine, I would say, is huge. If you're looking at the even bigger picture, the amount of people who are incarcerated or involved in the criminal justice system from the illegality of cannabis, That's a huge number. If you're talking about taxpayers who are funding the efforts to eradicate the cultivation, distribution, and consumption of cannabis, that's something that the non-consuming public is also footing the bill for. If you want to know why I personally feel that there is so much resistance from the federal government on this specific issue, I would first say that the government has a very hard time admitting that they were wrong. There's a lot of entrenched interest as well with this issue, specifically what's known as the prison industrial complex, where we used to have a lot of manufacturing jobs in this country, and when a lot of those manufacturing jobs got shipped overseas to cheaper labor markets, especially in rural America, those towns, when the factory closed, were going to go under. There's also a direct correlation with the increase in penalties for drug crimes, escalating our prison population to the point where we needed to build more prisons. And in a lot of those rural communities across America, when the factory closed, they built a prison in close proximity, and now that prison is the only job for miles around in rural America. And I can attest to this because I've been in Springfield at the Capitol when the government tries to close one of these prisons, and the prison guard unions are there actively protesting about how if you close this prison, the town of Lincoln, Illinois is going to die. The town of Dwight, Illinois is going to die. Pontiac. I mean, we can go through the list of towns in Illinois that have a prison within close proximity where that is the best job in the local community. And it's because of that job and those lives that are attached to this industry of incarceration that forces us to keep manufacturing prisoners, generally from the urban areas in this country. And that's where a lot of these nonviolent drug offenders who either are dealing or they're addicted to a substance, whether it is cannabis addiction, which I would say is just more of a psychological than physical addiction, whether it's alcoholism, or whether it's a more serious opioid-based addiction or a methamphetamine or cocaine addiction, we are now treating addiction through the criminal justice system instead of through the public health sector. And it's those entrenched interests that are behind that criminal justice system that are preventing us from moving forward and using more science-based policies with our drug policy in this country.
Just as an aside and as an anecdote, up to about 3 years ago, we used to do at the College of Veterinary Medicine, and specifically me, every 2 weeks used to go down to the dairy farm down at Vandalia State Prison. And for various reasons, they got rid of the dairy farm. But anyways, about 200 cows. And used to go down there every 2 weeks and do their reproduction exams. And just talking to the herdsman, who's not a prisoner, he said there was about 3,000 people at Vandalia State Prison, and about, I think he said between 75 and 78% are there for drug offenses. First time and second time drug offenses. And it's a lot of people. And he said a lot of it is marijuana, a lot of it is methamphetamines, of course.
Well, the other thing that factors into that is that with cannabis consumption, it's fat soluble, so it stays in the fat cells of the body, whereas something like alcohol or cocaine, it gets out of the body real quick. I mean, you can be drunk as a skunk Friday night and won't have any alcohol in your system Sunday morning at church. Cannabis, because it's fat soluble, you can be in a coffee shop in Amsterdam and then 3 weeks later test positive for cannabis still in your system, even though you've been not only out of the exposure of it, but it's been that prolonged of a period that you could very easily say that the intoxication or impairment is not there 3 weeks later, even though the substance is still found in the body because the cannabinoids are fat soluble.
Same writer had a question for me and said, what about growth hormone in milk? You're talking about recombinant bovine growth hormone. That was really popular, this 2013, probably starting about 1990. Monsanto had Posilac really ramped up milk production if you fed the cows a lot more. And so it was a management decision. Nonetheless, a lot of dairy producers, I don't know that they ever got up to about 30% of our dairy producers started using Posilac to increase milk production. They thought it was a good management technique for them. Because of public outcry, whether it was based on science or not, very few dairy producers are using Posilac anymore. In fact, Monsanto sold the rights to it 2 years ago to a Mexican firm, I think, because they really couldn't sell it here in the United States anymore. They just weren't making any money on it. Dairy producers. Go ahead, Dr. Buell.
In a prior life, I had a responsibility knowing a lot about that. And that's, I mean, I will make the statement, I know it's a strong statement, but organic milk is one of the most profitable fallacies that's ever been put on the American public. Growth hormone, there's multiple studies out there that show when it's used, the main reason, one reason dairy industry got out of it, because it pushed cows a little hard. I mean, it really pushed them where they were put, it was not good for the cow. But the cow puts more growth hormone in that milk than ever. There's fractional amount of the synthetic growth hormone that may be there from injection relative to what the cow puts in the milk herself. It's marketing.
The interesting thing too about natural growth hormone, if you're worried about that, organic versus conventionally produced milk, because conventionally produced milk, cows produce more milk, they eat more. Because of physiology, they flush growth hormone through the liver more times per minute, whatever. And so measurably, if you compare organic milk versus conventional milk, organic milk has usually a lot more natural growth hormone in it because cows aren't producing that much. They're not going through that liver metabolism cycle as often as high-producing dairy cows. So anyways, for Dan Linigan, do you know of any substantiated evidence of cannabis use eliminating or reducing tremors from Parkinson's?
Parkinson's, not offhand, to be quite honest. But there is such a wealth of information on the medical efficacy of cannabis now that you really could study it. You could have programs in medicine schools at universities like this one just on cannabinoid-based therapeutics. So just because I don't know doesn't mean that it's not out there. If the person is interested in investigating that on their own, that International Association for Cannabinoid Medicines and the International Cannabinoid Research Society would be the place to look for those peer-reviewed scholastic studies dealing with that specific condition. But again, it's one of those things where if we're talking about the human cost, allowing doctors to do their job, I think is one of the things that we should really trust them to do with cannabis and using cannabinoid-based therapeutics. One of the doctors who I've worked with in Springfield, she had a patient that she had prescribed opioid-based painkillers for, and that person took too many and overdosed and died. And that's what spawned her into her activism for cannabinoid-based pain relief medications, or to have legal access for it in this state. So again, it's one of those, just because I don't know about it doesn't mean that it's not out there. So please, do the research on your own. And I'd be more than willing to help with, pointing in the direction of where to find that research.
One of the beauties of internet is that we can all, really do some really good research. Even things like Google Scholar is a really potent search engine. You just throw in a few key terms and you get a whole nice list of. Okay, Weiss, were the 10 great public health achievements of the 20th century listed in order? Like immunization was number one and motor.
No, they were not. They were just listed randomly, and some of them, when I say in the last 100 years, I think the most of them have been in the last 70 or 75 years, I think, and that's not in any particular order.
And as long as you're in the focus, what types of cancer are prevented in boys from after getting the HPV vaccine? What does it prevent in boys? Or why would boys get it, I guess is what why would you want to vaccinate boys?
He's looking at me here. It prevents penile cancer, oral cancer, and anal cancer. All three of those, same with cervical cancer in women, and all three of those cancers with the exception of penile cancer, obviously. But the oral cancers are starting to find a lot more, oral pharyngeal cancers, and penile cancer, anal cancer. And plus, if they don't get it, they can't pass it as well. So.
Well, that was the next part of the question. Can boys or men, pass the HPV virus to girls through sexual contact?
Yes. And they do it a lot.
And they do. All right, Dan, again, isn't THC already legal in the drug Marinol?
It is. That is a synthetic cannabinoid that is on the market already. But what researchers, patients, and doctors are finding is that the different cannabinoids that are in cannabis, as well as the different strains of cannabis, so if you think of the plant of cannabis similar to tomatoes, where we have cherry tomatoes, we have grape tomatoes, beefsteaks, and different sizes of tomatoes and flavors of tomatoes and colors of tomatoes. Cannabis is kind of similar, where there's just different varieties of this plant. Those different varieties have different levels of these cannabinoids, which there's generally about 70, some people would say 60 of these cannabinoids. And it's the synergistic effect of these multiple cannabinoids that they're starting to find a lot more evidence for the different therapeutic uses of cannabis to treat people. So for example, one of the other cannabinoids, CBD, they're starting to find a lot more uses for it to treat muscle spasticity, especially in multiple sclerosis patients. And the thing with CBD is it's generally an inverse relationship to THC with herbal-based plant cannabis. So the higher the level of THC, and THC, for those who don't know, is the main psychoactive component of cannabis that gives the euphoric effect or the high effect. So people that are growing it for strictly recreational or psychoactive purposes, they try and increase the production of THC. What that ends up doing is driving down the levels of CBD. And if a patient is looking to have muscle relaxant properties with their cannabis, they would actually look to have a lower THC variety of cannabis that has a higher amount of CBD in it. CBN is another cannabinoid that they're really starting to research a lot more. But the THC is on the market. It is effective for some people, but it's not effective for everybody. And that's all the more reason to have access to the herbal cannabinoids, not just for the patients, but also for the researchers.
How amenable are physicians to prescribe Marinol to cancer patients, for example?
It's kind of hit or miss. I've had patients who tell me they've gone to their doctor to request it, and the doctor won't write the prescription for it.
Right.
Other doctors are pretty much willing to write that prescription if the person shows up and has insurance or is willing to pay them.
And the next question is, how many times do insurance refuse to pay for Marinol?
That I'm not that familiar with. I would imagine that they would cover it just because it is a FDA-approved medicine. It is manufactured under the standardized rules that most medicines are synthesized in those processes.
Dr. Johnson, have there been mammalian studies on the effects of energy drinks?
There have been a fair number of toxicity studies looking primarily at caffeine and the effects on a variety of species, and that's part of the data used to develop some of the information about dosing and what is and is not a safe dose. But there's really little information on looking at the synergistic effect of those combinations, where you've got guarana, you've got ginseng, you've got ginkgo, and caffeine in some of these substances. And so that's part of the real concern, especially among the American Academy of Pediatrics, about children being exposed, is that we have very little information on how all these things mixed together may affect a person, and especially a young person.
And a cell phone question for you. Are Bluetooths more dangerous than handheld?
It's interesting that you mentioned that, and actually for those researchers who are more concerned or believe the concern about cell phones, many of them feel the Bluetooth is a way that by keeping yourself away from the actual phone and having the Bluetooth, that actually is safer, that you'll reduce your exposure to the radio frequency radiation by using a Bluetooth. I personally don't want anything attached to my body, and so
Other than hearing?
piercings are fine, but you know, I hear enough voices in my head, so
Dan again, are there any nicotine overdoses reported?
You can definitely overdose and die from nicotine. It's a very toxic substance. I don't know of any specific cases of people just lighting up 20 cigarettes at once and passing out and dying from it. But as far as my understanding of the actual substance, nicotine itself, is that it's a very toxic substance, and people can derive it from cigarettes and use it to poison other people. So in that sense, I would think that it's an extremely dangerous substance. And with some of the work that I've done, when we're drafting legislation to legalize and regulate the adult cannabis market, I have a lot of advocates tell me that we need to write specifically in that legislation that adulterants will be prohibited in a legal market. Because with cigarettes, you know, the tobacco is something that a lot of people go and they buy, but they're addicted not to the tobacco, but they're addicted to the nicotine. and the people that sell the tobacco put the nicotine in there so that they can keep the customer coming back. And that's something that, you know, in foresight, we're looking to avoid in any type of legal cannabis market. But in terms of the nicotine, you know, I'm not a doctor, but I definitely think that that substance is a dangerous substance, not just for addiction levels, but for its toxicity levels or potential.
This is more of a research methodology question, I think, so we can all kind of take a crack at it. Isn't it difficult to have a controlled study on something that's smoked? How do you know everyone is smoking the same amount? So it's dose effect, right? Has the FDA studied something smoked?
They just, well, the FDA doesn't approve very many studies in the U.S. for cannabis therapeutics. They generally shift that all onto NIDA, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, and their whole political agenda is drug abuse. They're only going to fund and allow studies that are going to look at the potential negative effects of cannabis. Nevertheless, there was a doctor in San Francisco who did use smoked herbal cannabis in a study for treating neuropathic pain in HIV and AIDS patients. That was within the past 3 or 4 years, I would say. Otherwise, when it comes to the smoked cannabis, that's obviously the most common and stereotypical way that people consume this medicine. And it is a fact that there are carcinogens in smoked cannabis, but that's a result of the combustion of the plant material. And there's a lot of patients in states where cannabis is legal now that choose to use a method called vaporization, where they heat the cannabis to a level that vaporizes the cannabinoids, but it doesn't cause the plant material to combust, and you're able to avoid some of those materials that are a byproduct of the combustion of the plant material through vaporization. Other methods of administering herbal cannabinoids would be through topical agents like salves. You can also do it through tinctures or just edibles. You know, the infamous pot brownies. That's a very legitimate way for people to administer this medicine in states where it is legal. The good thing about either with the inhalation methods, whether it's smoking or through vaporization, is that the onset of the medicine is very immediate. And who that's extremely beneficial for are patients who need an antiemetic, people who are nauseous or throwing up all the time. Because you can't really give a pill to somebody to combat their vomiting if they're just going to throw up that pill. It'll never get in the bloodstream quick enough. And that's where something like an inhalation, an instant onset method of administration is extremely important, and that can be achieved through vaporization or through smoking. Other patients that have anecdotally told us that that instant onset is important are people with epilepsy. There was one patient in Illinois who he would have these grand mal seizures, and he would get this aura or this like tingling in his abdomen before one of these seizures happened. And he knew that if he could feel that tingling in his abdomen and he could notice that aura, if he could get to his pipe and take one inhalation from it, he could stop that approaching grand mal seizure in its tracks. And for somebody who suffers from epilepsy, that is significant. That dramatically improves their quality of life. It's extremely beneficial for their health. And it's one of those things where, you know, if I was a doctor, I could give you better insights as to why that happens, but with that inhalation method, it's able to get into the bloodstream so much quicker than if it is orally ingested.
For waste, I've read the flu vaccine is only about 60% effective, so why bother?
It's at least 60%.
And if you've had the
That's
flu,
why.
that's significant.
Right. Yeah, I mean,
But you're also vaccinating not only for yourself, but for other people, because it's only 60% if you're taking the entire population looking at it. But the fact is, young, healthy people who get the vaccine, it's very, very effective for. Really old, a lot older people or people who are immunocompromised, it doesn't work as well. So you young, healthy people who are taking your vaccine are protecting others. So that's why it's important. And trust me, we make no money off of those.
I'm just trying to find another one for someone other than Dan.
Are there a lot of, do you have samples questions for Dan?
Is that
Did you bring samples?
Oh, I see. No.
You got to get here real early for those things. They go real quick.
Those are long gone.
The politicians always ask that same question too.
Well, another question for Dan. Are there car side ways to check drivers for THC levels similar to the way you check alcohol levels for impaired drivers?
That's one of the biggest hurdles that we've found working with not just the lawmakers in Springfield, but the law enforcement lobbyists. Some of them are pretty decent folks. I can talk to them all night long about this substance, and they agree with me that this probably should be legal, but they have a position working for, say, the Chiefs of Police Association that says they're supposed to be against us. But detecting metabolites of THC in the bloodstream is one of the most difficult challenges because, like I said before, the impairment isn't directly related to those metabolites being present in the bloodstream. You can test for active metabolites versus inactive metabolites, but there isn't that direct correlation of like a BAC, blood alcohol content test, for cannabis. And that's why, at least from a legislative perspective, what we're looking to do until the private sector develops some type of recent usage or impairment-based test is to do the old-fashioned standardized field sobriety test of walk the line, stand on one foot and close your eyes, touch your nose, say the ABCs backwards. A lot of squad cars have video cameras on the dashboards now, and what we're looking to do is if you can videotape a driver who you suspect to be impaired from cannabis, have them go through that standardized field sobriety test and videotape it, and if they are impaired, it'll show up on that field sobriety test, and then that would be admissible in court to prosecute them. Because that's what the law enforcement agencies are really looking for, is the ability to prosecute when there is significant or at least relevant impairment there. But the private sector just hasn't developed that type of testing mechanism yet to test if there is, if somebody was smoking cannabis 20 minutes ago or 3 hours ago, because if you're just testing it within the blood or the urine, like I said, because it's fat soluble, it'll be in there long after the impairment is seated.
You think they could,
That is also a concern with prescription drugs, all sorts of things, that you can't test for those either, so easily.
Yeah, and I would say that one of the
And
biggest
they have the same
things
problems, so
is
it isn't
people who are impaired emotionally.
that way.
People who are significantly upset or people who are tired, those are some of the most dangerous drivers, I would say, on the road. The distracted drivers, the people who just found out that their spouse was cheating on them or just found out that a friend died and they want to go take the day off of work and they're driving home crying. I think that those emotionally impaired drivers are some of the most dangerous drivers that we don't have a standard test to prove they're impaired or not.
what were the levels of intoxication that were associated with texting while driving? It's just incredible. The texting while driving is associated with, or equivalent to, X number of percent alcohol, blood alcohol. It's just nuts. It's just nuts. But anyways,